Emperor Marcus Junius Philippus wanted it to be a party unlike any Rome had ever seen. So grand that the capital of the world would never experience anything like it again. Known today as Philip the Arab, this emperor had the distinct privilege of presiding over the highly anticipated secular games which commemorated Rome's 1,000-year anniversary in 248. An event that was so loaded with political and religious significance that we, as moderns, divorced from the landscapes of meaning that defined Roman thought and identity, find it difficult to fully comprehend. For while we can, at the most basic level, understand the propaganda value that an emperor wrestling with questions of legitimacy would find in overseeing such a momentous occasion, reducing these great games to their political utility alone deprives us of the ability to view them through Roman eyes, or to understand why Philip staked his future, meaning the very lives of himself and his entire family, on their success. To Philip, he was not simply overseeing bread and circuses designed to placate the masses. The games he planned were a solemn religious rite, and a renewal of Rome's pact with its patron deities, that he believed could renew the world and kickstart a golden age. It was a world that desperately needed renewal. Dating back to the death of Severus Alexander over a decade earlier in 235, Rome had experienced profound internal strife and disorder. Civil war was rampant as central authority and the state itself withered before the ambitions of generals, who were more and more willing to act as warlords untethered from previous norms and make their own plays for the throne. No matter which claimant emerged triumphant from these internecine squabbles, all the dead were Roman, and there were no vanquished external foes that could be plundered to replenish the state treasury. In addition, the constant redeployment of troops for internal conflicts left the empire's frontiers vulnerable. The skeletal remnants left on watch in the borderlands were often overrun or simply eluded by tribal armies that pillaged Roman territory, which had not seen war in generations. In the east, the situation was even more grim, as a resurgent Persia made successive incursions into the wealthy eastern provinces, humiliating Roman armies with alarming regularity. In fact, it was in the hazy aftermath of Persian victory at Meshech in 244 that the young emperor Gordian III died, and Philip was declared emperor. Our understanding of the timeline is murky, and perhaps even intentionally obscured by Roman traditions to mask the defeat. But we do know that Philip paid a ransom of 500,000 gold pieces to Shapur I for the safe passage of the legions back to Roman territory. This money had to come from somewhere, and sources tell us that Philip's older brother, who ruled over the eastern half of the empire in his name, became incredibly unpopular as he scrounged up the funds to pay the Persians, as well as secure the continued loyalty of the army. Adding to the fiscal woes were the construction costs associated with turning Philip's hometown into a grand city renamed Philippopolis, that was to feature all of the latest modern amenities. It is also important to remember that this was occurring alongside the steady drumbeat of debasement that was feeding an inflationary cycle which the Romans lacked the economic sophistication to truly understand. With coin being as tight as it was, and desperate to allocate more funding to his great games, Philip opted to suspend the subsidies and payments that Rome had given to chieftains on the Danube frontier to buy their loyalty. Though these payments of gold and gifts are often characterized as tribute, the reality is slightly more complex. Rome was not paying the tribes from a position of abject weakness. Rather, the gifts were meant to divide and conquer those on the far side of the Danube, and encourage dissension among them. Rome would even periodically shift how its payments were structured to keep any one chieftain from amassing too much power, and to heighten rivalries among the tribes. On the back of his sustained military success on the Danube during the early years of his reign, Philip thus doubtlessly felt that the program had outlived its usefulness. With hindsight, we know he miscalculated, and that the decision came back to bite him, but we can at least recover the logic that led him to act in this manner. For the sudden withdrawal of subsidies that these tribes felt they were owed led to incursions into Roman territory by groups such as the Carpi and Goths in 248. To compound Philip's troubles, his heavy-handed collection of taxes in the east fueled the revolt of a usurper named Jotapion in Syria in 249. This short-lived eastern revolt was suppressed, and the tribal forces on the Danube were beaten back. But in the grand cycle of disorder that plagued Rome during the 3rd century, the troops who had expelled the Gothic invaders did the natural thing, and named their commander Pactantius as emperor, setting the stage for another civil war. Fortunately for Philip, the Danube legions got cold feet, and soon murdered the man they had just elevated. To mollify the restive soldiers, and discipline the chief instigators of the plot, Philip dispatched the trusted senator Decius to the front. But, rather than accept punishment, the soldiers then acclaimed Decius as emperor, supposedly against his will. Decius then met Philip in battle at Verona, and defeated him, resulting in the death of the emperor and his son. Like the other emperors of his day, Philip's rise to the throne had been bloody, and so too was his downfall. For his secular games of 248 obviously failed to usher in the heralded Golden Age, and Philip's decision to prioritize the funding of the games over payments to tribes on the Danube kick-started another cycle of invasion and civil war that culminated in his defeat and death. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. From our perspective then, the decision to shift the state budget away from payments to the tribes and towards the secular games looks incredibly foolish and short-sighted, especially at a time when inflation was sending Rome into economic freefall and coins still needed to be found to pay the Persians. But to see this as a matter of state finance alone is to neglect the religious dimension of the games and the significance they carried to Romans. We must understand that Philip obviously did not believe he was inviting his own destruction by failing to pay the tribes. Rather, he was confident that, if executed correctly, his games would re-inaugurate the Pax Deorum, and bring about the divine blessings that could secure victory, prosperity, and peace for the beleaguered empire. For despite their name, the secular games were totally divorced from our modern conception of the secular. Those who have watched my previous material on Roman religion will know that in ancient Rome all things were deeply religious in character. So, the name of these games denotes instead that they were connected to the great 100-year cycles of history known as saeculum, representing the close of one era and the beginning of the next. Over time, this word took on the meaning of something being temporal and worldly, hence its employ in the Middle Ages to denote that it was related to non-spiritual affairs. But the modern definition, which evolved from this later usage, had no bearing on the Roman practice. With its religious connotations, the Roman idea of the saeculum was, unsurprisingly, closely tied to their conception of time, history, and existence itself. The Romans held that history manifested itself in grand epochs or cycles, and events could recur time and time again. This foundational aspect of the Roman worldview is well known, but too little reflected upon, and, in my view, helps explain the strains of fatalism present in many diverse strands of Roman thought. This teleology of reality, time, and existence is exemplified by the mythological concept of the ages of man, which is articulated by Hesiod and a number of other classical authors. In the ancient imagination, time progressed from an age of gold to one of silver, then bronze, and finally reached its nadir at the age of iron. To the Romans, the Golden Age was a time of peace and plenty. First of all, the deathless gods who dwell on Olympus made a golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos when he was reigning in heaven. And they lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Miserable age rested not on them, but, with legs and arms never failing, they made merry with feasting beyond the reach of all evils. When they died, it was as though they were overcome with sleep, and they had all good things, for the fruitful earth unforced bare them fruit abundantly and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands with many good things, rich in flocks, and loved by the blessed gods. It was this idyllic paradise, akin to our prevailing cultural ideas of the Garden of Eden, that they attempted to recreate in miniature every year during the Saturnalia festival. But after the conclusion of that great celebration, reality seeped back in, and Romans confronted the unfortunate truth that they lived in an age of wickedness. The harsh iron was last. Immediately every kind of wickedness erupted into this age of baser natures. Truth, shame, and honor vanished. In their place were fraud, deceit, and trickery, violence, and pernicious desires. Though the Romans of Philip's day surveyed the chaos around them and naturally concluded that they were in the age of iron, in this tradition, pessimism and optimism were balanced on a knife's edge, as, though the world existed in a state of perpetual decline, there remained the assurance that renewal was possible. Like the progression of the seasons, but on a cosmic scale, all that Rome needed to reverse its fortunes and escape its current misery was the restoration of a golden age. But while the Romans earnestly hoped for this time of renewal, they also believed that this could only occur with divine approval, that their sacrifices and devotion would need to be accepted by the Roman pantheon. We can sense the anxiety gripping Roman society at this critical moment, as they confronted the limitations of the philosophical determinism implied in their theories of the great historical cycles, with the heartfelt concern and piety that were only possible at moments of profound distress. These tensions were exacerbating the shortcomings of Roman popular religion, resulting in a fraying of the near-universal religious consensus that had existed since time immemorial in the Roman world. Strange Eastern cults, mystery religions, henotheistic creeds, and foreign philosophies that promised salvation of one sort or another were growing in popularity, with the more traditional Romans, like the aforementioned Decius, believing that this increased theological deviance is what had caused Rome to lose its divine protection in the first place. To re-solidify its pact with the gods, then, all that was required was a return to the traditions which had seen Rome prosper. The secular games were thus the perfect vehicle for renewal, because they had their roots in some of the oldest rites observed in Rome, dating back to the dawn of the Republic in the 6th century BCE. Traditionally said to have been inaugurated to appease Dis and his fellow underworld spirits, the earliest rituals paid homage to Proserpine, the goddess of fertility who was held in the underworld for 3 months every year by her husband. In these early days, the hope was that by calling her forth, she would be accompanied by spring, bringing new life and with it a sense of spiritual renewal for a new age. The evident success of this initial ritual proved to the Romans that it had been attuned to the divine will and earned it a place in the Roman canon of sanctioned festivals, with tradition holding that diviners stipulated that it should take place every 100 years, the idea being that no one alive to see any one iteration of the sacrifices would be alive to see the next. Like a grand ship of Theseus, all of Rome would have changed during this period, but the Republic itself persevered, and thus required a similar renewal of its pact with the gods. Given the fact that no person would have seen 2 iterations of these sacrifices, we should not be surprised that observance of the ritual shifted tremendously from what seems initially to have been a more somber affair towards a grand festival that was the highlight of its year. In fact, the ritual even seems to have fallen into abeyance in its early days, as iterations of it are not well attested until 249 BCE, during the First Punic War, a time when a Roman religious revival of unprecedented proportions that resurrected neglected rites and cults of the past coincided with the severe societal stress Rome was experiencing, as Carthage initially seemed to have the upper hand in the conflict. Rome believed its misfortunes were the result of it turning its back on these old traditions, and was determined to accurately recreate the rites they felt were necessary to win back divine favor. The secular ritual would be repeated again in 146, our first clear evidence of the games occurring on a set centennial cycle. Though still associated with Dis and Prosperina, they had a much more celebratory tone and occurred unquestionably alongside great games in this incarnation, uncoincidentally mirroring the vastly different fortunes of the Republic, which was now the unquestioned power of the Mediterranean. But Roman fortunes would turn within the next century, as its lack of worthy external foes exacerbated internal divisions. 49 saw the onset of the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, and the secular rites went unobserved. This was but one conflict of a century of disorder and civil strife. However, after the dust settled and Octavian emerged as the first emperor in 27, he embarked upon a program of spiritual renewal in Rome, believing that rites such as the secular games had not been neglected because of disorder, but that Roman weakness and vacillation on spiritual matters had broken the sacred pact with the gods, and brought about the very disorder that contributed to Rome's divisions. To Octavian, this was a cycle of ruin that only he could stop, and it required his assumption of unprecedented new powers, and the domination of religious life to inaugurate a new golden age that would rescue Rome from the despair it had brought upon itself by neglecting its patron deities. Though Octavian's political and military program marched in lockstep, I do not believe that he was using religious language or themes to manipulate the masses, or mask his power grabs, as is sometimes argued. Rather, the complete unity of these spheres in the Roman mind made it appropriate, and indeed perfectly natural, for political and religious programs to work towards the same ends. He was seeking a break with the troubled past and a new golden age. As such, he founded his authority not on military successes, as had previous consuls, dictators, and warlords, but on respect for tradition, and his unique relationship with the gods as the avenue through which peace and prosperity could be achieved under the new regime. Hence Octavian became Augustus, an inherently religious title, and would steadily accumulate divine honors that culminated in his post-mortem deification. One of the many rites he revived was the secular games, which he celebrated in 17 BCE, with his version of the games for the first time shifting away from the focus on underworld deities and towards the centrality of the emperor in Roman public life, honoring a new group of gods connected with the founding of the city, its spiritual rebirth, and the privileged position of his family, at the core of this sacred new arrangement with the gods. Augustus deftly positioned himself as a new founder, a new Romulus, a ruler capable of ushering in a new age. Though celebrated well over 100 years since the last games, Augustus's games were not on the calendar of the century cycle preserved by ancient tradition, so the Emperor Claudius decided to hold his own games on this schedule in 48, to commemorate the 800th anniversary of Rome's founding. Though, despite precedent, he did face some ridicule for holding his games so soon after Augustus. He also celebrated secular games, alleging that they had been given too early by Augustus, and not reserved for the regular time, although he himself writes in his own history that when they had been discontinued for a long time, Augustus restored them to their proper place after a very careful calculation of the intervals. Therefore the herald's proclamation was greeted with laughter, when he invited the people, in the usual formula, to games which no one had ever seen or would ever see again. For some were still living who had seen them before, and some actors who had appeared at the former performance appeared at that time as well. Thus, two different tracks of once-in-a-lifetime games would persist, and so the secular games were celebrated by Domitian in 88, following Augustus's revival, and in 148 by Antoninus Pius to celebrate the 900th anniversary. Septimius Severus would also hold games on the Augustan schedule in 220. All these emperors knew the value of the games for propaganda purposes, and were not going to let disputes over chronology get in the way of a good time, nor of the prestige associated with being the one to symbolically usher Rome into a new golden age. Thus, we can understand why Philip looked to the games with such anticipation, and even hope, and our evidence shows that the public relations groundwork for these games was laid years in advance. Millions of special coins were minted, which communicated Philip's ambitions and goals for the games, with the imperial propaganda explicitly stating that the 1000th anniversary of Rome's founding represented the end of one era and the start of a new one, terming the dawn of Rome's second millennium as an unprecedented saeculum novum. Befitting the occasion, these games were enormously expensive. The 3 days of celebration, from April 21st to the 23rd, featured beast hunts, theatrical plays, chariot races, sea battles in a specially flooded area, and apparently an astounding 1,000 gladiator bouts, as well as the associated feasting and drinking. But it wasn't all bread and circuses. There was something for the sophisticated set to sink their teeth into as well, with competitions for speakers, musicians, poets, and philosophers, all of whom were sure to praise the imperial house so as to increase their chances of victory. Philip hoped to inspire loyalty in his subjects through displays of beneficence and to underscore the legitimacy of his young dynasty. After all, he had ascended to the throne under uncertain circumstances, and his rise from provincial obscurity to the heights of imperial power symbolized the immense stresses that were warping Roman society. With the glories of the Pax Romana fading fast in the midst of famines and plagues, Rome was beset by internal divisions, as well as external foes. Put simply, the empire had lost its swagger. The sense of triumphalism was fading, and doubts about the security of the empire and its eternal fortunes were creeping in. These material realities were again reflected in the philosophies of the day, with Stoic pessimism existing alongside Christian apocalypticism. If these two schools with such divergent values could find agreement, we should not be surprised that across Roman society as a whole there was a desperate need for renewal and deliverance. In the words of Cassius Dio, writing at the beginning of the crisis, "Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust, as affairs did for the Romans of that day." Surrounded by ruin and disorder, we can understand why Philip felt that a renewal was needed, and why, even as emperor, the problems facing Rome were beyond his ability to address without divine intervention. For, in my opinion, we think too much in modern terms when weighing only Philip's propaganda considerations and desire to be associated with Romulus, Augustus, and Antoninus Pius in his celebration of the games. This was a significant benefit, yes, but Philip would have honestly and truly believed that the celebration of these rites had real, efficacious power to alter Rome's fortunes. The bleakness of his situation would have actually emboldened him in the belief that only the gods were capable of resolving Rome's omni-crisis, and that he had been chosen to preside over this occasion that would usher in not just the dawn of a new cycle, but a new millennium, a new age. With the benefit of history, we understand the folly of Philip's ambitions here. To us, he is but a footnote in the history of Rome, a man who, if known at all, is nothing more than the answer to a trivia question on who reigned during the millennial anniversary. But, though it seems obvious once given thought, it is easy to forget that Philip was not an afterthought in his own day and age. He was the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, the protagonist of the reality in which he operated. For Philip was human, just as we all are, and was naturally tempted to think more highly of himself than he deserved. And when one is the unquestioned sovereign of a hyperpower, having a high opinion of oneself is inevitable. That he rose from relatively humble origins to this position would only have confirmed a belief that he enjoyed divine favor, in that he had indeed been selected as their emissary who was charged with renewing Rome and delivering the empire from the perils that beset it on every side. We know Philip as a man who was undone by his own short-sightedness and hubris, as one who neglected the concrete material realities to placate spiritual phantasms, and who sought to earn the favor of a pantheon that has long since seen its last fires extinguished. But it is worth repeating the obvious point that this is not how he saw himself, and that he did not know how his story would end. Hesitant as I am to psychoanalyze a man that existed nearly 2,000 years before me, and who was the product of a culture and community radically different from my own in every respect, I do have no qualms about assigning to him the same intrinsic human instincts, feelings, and desires that we all share. So, though it goes beyond the evidence presented in our sources, I feel grounded in saying that Philip had dreams about the secular games, and truly believed that they would save his world and mark an end to the Age of Iron. When taking this line of logic into consideration, his actions, which we moderns are too quick to characterize as irrational, take on the trappings of a logic that, though far from ironclad, was at least internally consistent. I don't want to be an apologist for a man who was deeply flawed, but I do want to emphasize that the Philip remembered by history and the historical Philip are radically different persons. And though this doesn't in any way justify his blunder of refusing to pay the tribes as expected, we can at least understand how he fell into this pattern of thought. For as previously shown, he was far from alone in his belief in the cyclical nature of history, or the need to consistently reaffirm Rome's pact with its gods. Romulus had been divinized by the Romans for establishing the covenant that had allowed Rome to prosper, and we cannot fault Philip for seeking to emulate him. For though modern scholars have shown that there is ample reason to doubt the veracity of the tales surrounding the foundation of the city, to the Romans of Philip's day, the myths and legends were not just true, they were so true that they could not possibly be false, not just beyond doubt, but beyond the ability to even conceptualize the beginnings of doubt. True materialist atheism was nigh impossible. For those of a more skeptical bent, there was enough wiggle room in the myriad conflicting traditions of Rome's foundation to find the narrative that impinged on their sense of sophistication the least, or flattered their existing preconceptions enough for them to grant their intellectual assent. And they always did. The 1,000-year anniversary of what was regarded as an actual historical event was thus infused with tremendous symbolism, and eagerly awaited by the Roman populace for its ability to signify the start of a new chapter in Rome's great cycle. While it is easy for us moderns to scoff at the superstition needed to believe that a change of date had auspicious powers, we should remember that Christians in the year 1000 were convinced that the prophecies of Revelation were to be imminently fulfilled, even though there was no doctrinal reason to believe that the kingdom of God, a Christian analog for the pagan idea of the Golden Age, was to be associated with that year. Those of us alive in 1999 will also remember that the dawn of this millennium was also treated with a sense of apocalyptic dread, and not simply because of Y2K. It seems we humans, even at our most rational, can't help but imbue numbers and dates with symbolic significance that they don't merit. However, please don't try saying that to your significant other if you forget your anniversary. That this mysticism and expectation is still with us, even in a world that has been thoroughly desacralized and is largely devoid of the mundane universal sense of enchantment that permeated all aspects of Roman thought, should help us to understand why Roman emotions were at a fever pitch. These emotions were so pronounced that we must wonder to what degree they penetrated into the Christian and Jewish communities that stood at arm's length from pagan ritual. For, despite the common conception that the pre-Constantinian Church was removed from Roman society at large, the truth is that as Christians increased in number, the presence of Christians in prominent social positions also rose exponentially. This was no longer the church of outcasts, slaves, and women. The faithful were numbered among the imperial household staff, and, concentrated as they were in cities, Many held prominent intellectual positions throughout the empire. In fact, Philip was so amenable to Christians that he was rumored to be among their flock, and later writers would dubiously name him, not Constantine, as the first Christian emperor. I find this unlikely, but the fact that it was even plausible demonstrates that the Church was making real strides, in not just numerical terms, but in social acceptance. It was the practitioners of this once foreign and seditious religion that Philip should have thanked for ensuring that there was never again an iteration of the secular games that could challenge his. In fact, there was never to be another set of games at all. For 110 years after the games of Septimius Severus, when the games would have next been possible on the Augustan cycle, the empire was ruled by Constantine, an actual Christian, and though he continued for a time to utilize pagan imagery during his reign, there were no secular games, as these were so infused with the power of the old gods that participating in them was unthinkable to the Christian sovereign. He must have felt that by aligning Rome with a new god, he had secured a golden age for his empire. The pagan historian Zosimus disagreed, and would blame the neglect of the games for the eventual fall of the West. Experience assures us that while these ceremonies were duly performed according to the direction of the oracles, the empire was secure, and likely to retain its sovereignty over almost all the known world. And on the other hand, when they were neglected, about the time when Diocletian laid down the imperial dignity, it fell to decay, and degenerated insensibly into barbarism. When Constantine and Licinius were in their third consulship, the 110 years were completed, and the festival ought to have been kept according to custom. But it was neglected, and affairs consequently declined to their present unfortunate condition. Philip's games, then, can be said to represent the high watermark of Rome's traditional deities during the calamitous 3rd century, a time of devotion and faithfulness to the ways of the ancestors before the impotence of the old pantheon to preserve Roman fortunes led to the empire turning its back on Jupiter and his kin in favor of dynamic new cults, faiths and philosophies that promised eternal salvation in a world where stability was disappearing by the day. Philip had hoped to light the first fires of a new age, and in a strange way he succeeded, and step by step Rome would gradually enter its Christian era. Though the empire would eventually collapse in the West, it was the influence of this new faith that provided the bonds for a common civilization across much of Europe, and its role in shaping all aspects of the world down to the modern day cannot be overstated. So influential was the new creed, in fact, that it has redefined how we measure time. Year zero is no longer the foundation of Rome by Romulus, but the hypothesized date of Jesus' birth. Thus, Philip is redefined not as a man existing in the year 1000 AUC, but as a man of 248 CE. Like us, his existence and relation to history, defined not by the inauguration of pacts with arcane deities by a warrior king, but by the birth of a boy in a manger. The Christian philosophy of time that dominates now has abolished the idea of cyclical history in favor of a linear conception born of the idea that all history is working towards its logical endpoint in the second coming of Christ. That a linear perception of time is the most pervasive perspective on history is now so ingrained in our collective worldview that it goes unremarked on and unquestioned. By reminding us of just how seemingly arbitrary these ubiquitous ideas and concepts can be, we are able to understand that we too are products of historical forces, of our times, and of imperceivably complex chains of events that began long before we were ever born. But, far from robbing us of agency, an understanding of this conditionality is what is required to rise above it, to defeat the forces that bind us, and finally create a golden age that lasts.